The piercing wail of sirens cut through the quiet suburban neighborhood on a chilly autumn morning. Officer David Chen's heart raced as he received the distress call, smoke billowing from a two-story house, with reports of twin babies trapped inside. As he sped through the streets, his 13 years of police experience couldn't prepare him for what awaited. The scene was chaos when he arrived. Thick black smoke poured from the windows, and flames licked the sides of the house. A young mother stood screaming hysterically on the front lawn, held back by neighbors as she tried repeatedly to run back inside. Her 9-month-old twins were still in their nursery on the second floor. The fire department was still 5 minutes out, but David knew those babies didn't have 5 minutes. Without hesitation, he wrapped his uniform jacket around his face and charged into the burning building. The heat hit him like a wall, and the smoke burned his eyes, but he pressed forward, crawling on his hands and knees up the stairs. The nursery door was closed, a small blessing that had kept some of the smoke at bay. Inside, he found the twins in their cribs, remarkably calm despite the chaos around them. Years later, David would recall this moment as both the most terrifying and most peaceful of his life, two innocent faces looking up at him through the haze. He gathered both babies in his arms, tucking them inside his shirt to protect them from the smoke. The journey back down was treacherous, parts of the ceiling were now falling, and the smoke had grown so thick he could barely see. His lungs screamed for air, but the weight of those two precious lives against his chest drove him forward. Just as he reached the front door, a support beam crashed down behind him, missing them by inches. He burst out onto the lawn, where paramedics immediately took the twins while others helped him to an oxygen mask. The mother fell to her knees, sobbing with relief as her babies were checked over and found to be perfectly healthy, save for some minor smoke inhalation. The local news praised Officer Chen as a hero, but he insisted he was just doing his job. The story might have ended there, like many other rescue stories, but fate had different plans. What no one knew that day was that this dramatic rescue would set in motion a chain of events that would reconnect these lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The twins' mother, Mrs. Patel, was a widow who worked 2 jobs to support her children. In the days following the fire, investigators discovered that the blaze had been caused by faulty wiring, a problem Mrs. Patel's landlord had repeatedly ignored despite her complaints. The story caught the attention of a prominent local attorney, who offered to represent her pro bono in a lawsuit against the negligent property owner. David checked in on the family regularly in the weeks that followed, feeling somehow responsible for their welfare even after the rescue. He helped Mrs. Patel navigate the complicated process of dealing with insurance companies and finding temporary housing. His wife began babysitting the twins occasionally, giving their exhausted mother some much-needed rest. The community rallied around the family. Local businesses organized fundraisers, and neighbors donated clothes, toys, and furniture to help them start over. Through it all, David remained a constant presence, though he never sought recognition for his ongoing support. He simply couldn't forget the moment he'd held those 2 tiny lives in his arms, knowing their futures hung in the balance. What David didn't know was that his actions that day would come back to touch his own life in profound ways. The twins, too young to remember the rescue, would grow up hearing the story of the brave police officer who saved them. But the real twist in this tale was still years away, waiting to unfold when they least expected it. The lawsuit against the landlord eventually settled, providing Mrs. Patel with enough money to buy a small house of her own in a safer neighborhood. She invited David and his wife to the housewarming, where he watched the twins, now toddling around on steady legs, playing safely in their new home. Looking at them, he felt a deep satisfaction knowing he'd not only saved their lives but helped give them a chance at a better future. As the first year after the rescue drew to a close, David received a handmade card from Mrs. Patel and the twins on the anniversary of the fire. Inside was a photo of the babies, healthy and smiling, along with a note that simply read, "Thank you for giving us tomorrow." He pinned it to his locker at the police station, never suspecting that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary story that would span decades. 15 years passed like pages turning in a book. The twins, Aisha and Arjun Patel, had grown into bright teenagers who filled their mother's life with pride and joy. The memories of that terrifying fire had faded to distant shadows, kept alive mainly through the stories their mother told them and the annual cards they still sent to Officer Chen. David Chen's life had changed too. He'd risen through the ranks to become a police captain, earning respect not just for his bravery but for his dedication to community policing. The photo of the twins as babies still hung in his office, though now joined by dozens of other memories from his years of service. Sometimes, younger officers would ask about it, and he'd share the story, always emphasizing how it taught him that a police officer's job wasn't just about dramatic rescues but about being there for the community every single day. Mrs. Patel had transformed their modest house into a warm, welcoming home. She'd started a small catering business from her kitchen, and her Indian food had become a neighborhood favorite. The struggles of those early years had given way to stability, though she never forgot the kindness shown to her family in their time of need. She made sure her children grew up understanding the value of community and the importance of helping others. The twins were now in their sophomore year of high school. Aisha had inherited her mother's entrepreneurial spirit and ran a successful tutoring program for elementary school students. Arjun had developed a passion for technology and spent his free time building computers and teaching coding to kids at the local community center. Neither of them remembered the fire, but they'd grown up with a deep respect for first responders, especially police officers. One spring morning, everything changed. Arjun was walking to school when he witnessed a terrible car accident. Without hesitation, he rushed to help, pulling an elderly man from his smoking vehicle moments before it caught fire. The scene drew him back to a story he'd heard countless times but never truly understood until that moment, the story of his own rescue. The local news covered Arjun's heroic act, and when reporters asked what made him risk his life to save a stranger, he mentioned the story of Officer Chen saving him and his sister as babies. The story quickly went viral, capturing people's imagination with its full-circle moment. But nobody expected what would happen next. Captain David Chen was sitting in his office when he saw the news report. Watching Arjun describe the rescue story brought tears to his eyes, but something else caught his attention. The elderly man Arjun had saved was Mr. Thompson, David's former training officer who'd taught him everything he knew about being a good police officer. The very man who had prepared him for moments like the twins' rescue all those years ago. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect to be real, but it sparked something in David's mind. He'd been running a youth program at the police department for years, trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Looking at Arjun's interview, he saw something familiar, the same instinct to help others that had driven him into that burning building 15 years ago. Meanwhile, Aisha had been deeply affected by her brother's actions. She began researching the original fire, interviewing neighbors who remembered that day, and collecting newspaper clippings. Her tutoring students became fascinated by the story, and she found herself teaching them about community service and bravery through her family's experience. Mrs. Patel watched her children with a mixture of pride and concern. Arjun's act of heroism had stirred up memories she'd long tried to put behind her, but it had also revealed something remarkable about her children. They had inherited not just her resilience but also the spirit of service that Officer Chen had demonstrated that fateful day. The story might have remained just another inspiring news piece, but fate wasn't finished weaving its threads. Mr. Thompson, recovering in the hospital, requested to meet the young man who had saved his life. When he learned about the connection to David Chen, he insisted on organizing a reunion of all the people involved in both rescues. As plans for the reunion came together, none of them realized that the biggest surprise was yet to come. The simple act of a teenager helping an elderly man had set in motion events that would reveal an even more extraordinary connection between their lives, one that had been hidden in plain sight for 15 years. The local community center offered to host the reunion, and as RSVPs began flowing in, it became clear that this was more than just a meeting of a few people connected by two incidents. It was becoming a celebration of how single acts of courage could ripple through time, touching lives in unexpected ways. Teachers from the twins' school, regulars from Mrs. Patel's catering business, and officers from David's precinct all wanted to be part of this remarkable story. As the day of the reunion approached, each person involved felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. David spent hours looking through old case files from the fire, remembering details he'd forgotten. The twins dug out their mother's old photo albums, seeing their early years through new eyes. And Mr. Thompson, still recovering but determined to attend, worked with his physical therapist to ensure he'd be strong enough for the event. Little did they know, this reunion would be just the beginning of an even more amazing chapter in their intertwined stories. The real revelation, the one that would leave them all speechless, was about to surface, proving that sometimes the most incredible twists in life are the ones that were there all along, waiting to be discovered. The community center buzzed with excitement on the day of the reunion. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and tables laden with Mrs. Patel's famous samosas and other local delicacies lined the room. People from all walks of life filtered in, police officers in their dress uniforms, community members in their Sunday best, and teenagers from the high school where the twins had become minor celebrities. David Chen arrived early, his wife beside him carrying a worn photo album. He'd spent the previous evening looking through old case files and photographs, not just from the twins' rescue but from his entire career. Something had been nagging at his mind, a connection he couldn't quite place, like a word on the tip of his tongue. The Patel family entered to warm applause. Arjun walked beside Mr. Thompson, who insisted on using a cane rather than his wheelchair for the occasion. The elderly man had become a regular visitor at their house during his recovery, regaling the twins with stories from his days training young police officers. Aisha followed with her mother, carrying a carefully wrapped package that held a surprise for Officer Chen. As people mingled and shared stories, the atmosphere grew thick with emotion. Old neighbors recounted the day of the fire, and fellow officers spoke about how the rescue had changed David's approach to community policing. The twins' former teachers described how the story had inspired other students to pursue careers in public service. Mr. Thompson took the microphone, his voice steady despite his recent ordeal. He spoke about destiny and how life had a way of coming full circle. As he described Arjun's rescue of him, he mentioned something that made David Chen sit up straight in his chair, a detail about the car accident that suddenly clicked something into place in his mind. The elderly man explained how his car had swerved to avoid a mother pushing a stroller, causing him to hit the lamppost. That mother turned out to be the daughter of a firefighter who had arrived at the Patel's house fire just minutes after David had brought the twins to safety. But there was more to the story, much more. As Mr. Thompson continued speaking, David pulled out his phone and began frantically searching through old photos. His hands trembled slightly as he found what he was looking for. He whispered something to his wife, who gasped quietly and squeezed his hand. Aisha stepped up next, unwrapping the package she'd brought. Inside was a beautifully crafted photo album, filled with newspaper clippings, cards, and photographs documenting not just the fire rescue but the 15 years that followed. As she presented it to David, she mentioned a discovery she'd made while researching their family history for the project. The room grew quiet as Aisha revealed that while organizing her mother's old documents, she'd found a faded photograph from the day they moved into their new house. In the background of the image, barely noticeable, was a familiar face, a much younger Mr. Thompson, helping to carry furniture. He had been volunteering with a local moving company that helped families displaced by disasters, but had never made the connection to the twins he'd helped that day. But David Chen knew there was an even bigger revelation waiting to be shared. His hands shook slightly as he stood up, holding the photo he'd found on his phone. The piece of the puzzle that had been eluding him for weeks had finally fallen into place. "There's something else," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I never realized until today." He explained that while reviewing old case files, he discovered that his own father, a retired firefighter, had been one of the first responders to a different house fire 30 years ago, a fire where he had saved a young boy. That boy had grown up to become a dedicated public servant, inspired by the firefighter who had saved his life. The room fell silent as David turned to Mr. Thompson. "That boy was you, wasn't it?" he asked. "You became a police officer because of my father's rescue, then trained me, which prepared me to save the twins. And now, Arjun has saved you. We're all connected by a chain of rescues spanning 3 generations." The revelation sent ripples of amazement through the room. Mrs. Patel wiped tears from her eyes as she realized how intricately their lives had been woven together long before the day of the fire. Mr. Thompson, who had never known the name of the firefighter who saved him as a child, sat in stunned silence. As the implications of this discovery sank in, more connections began to emerge. The firefighter's daughter who Mr. Thompson had swerved to avoid was planning to become a paramedic. Aisha had recently been accepted into a summer program at the fire department. Even the community center hosting their reunion had been built with funds from a foundation started by David's father to support first responders and their families. The story had come full circle in ways none of them could have imagined. What seemed like random acts of heroism were actually links in a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back decades. Each rescue had inspired the next generation to step up and help others, creating a legacy that continued to grow. As the evening drew to a close, David shared one final thought. He talked about how every act of kindness, every moment of courage, sent ripples through time that could touch lives in unexpected ways. The real miracle wasn't just the dramatic rescues, it was how these moments of crisis brought out the best in people and forged connections that lasted a lifetime. The twins listened intently, understanding for the first time that they weren't just survivors of a fire, they were part of a larger story of community, courage, and connection. A story that was still being written with every passing day. The weeks following the reunion brought changes no one could have anticipated. The story of the 3-generation chain of rescues caught the attention of national media, but it was the quiet, personal transformations that proved most meaningful. The revelations had awakened something in each person involved, leading them down unexpected paths. David Chen's father, now in his 70s, flew in from his retirement home in Florida after hearing about the connection to Mr. Thompson. The reunion between the retired firefighter and the boy he'd saved so many years ago was powerful. They spent hours sharing memories, filling in gaps in each other's stories, and marveling at how their lives had intersected in ways they never knew. For the twins, learning about their place in this legacy of service sparked new ambitions. Arjun began spending time at the police station's youth program, where David mentored him in emergency response and community service. The teenage boy who had once been saved from a fire was now learning how to save others, showing a natural talent for staying calm under pressure. Aisha's summer program at the fire department took on new meaning. She threw herself into the training with determination, earning top marks in first aid and emergency preparedness. Her instructors noted that she had an unusual ability to connect with people in crisis, a skill she attributed to growing up hearing stories about the compassion shown to her family in their time of need. Mrs. Patel's catering business unexpectedly became a hub for community storytelling. People would gather at her events, sharing their own tales of times they'd been helped by strangers or had stepped up to help others. She began hosting monthly community dinners where first responders and local families could connect, breaking down barriers and building understanding. Mr. Thompson, fully recovered from his accident, started a mentorship program pairing retired first responders with at-risk youth. He never forgot how a single act of heroism had changed the course of his life, and he wanted to create opportunities for others to experience that same transformation. The program quickly gained support from both the police and fire departments. But perhaps the most profound change came in the form of a discovery at the city archives. While researching the history of first responders in their community, Aisha found records of another rescue that tied their families together even further. 25 years ago, Mrs. Patel's late husband had pulled someone from a car wreck, someone who turned out to be David Chen's cousin. This additional connection hit Mrs. Patel hard. She had never known about her husband's act of heroism, as he had passed away before having the chance to share many of his stories with their children. The discovery helped her feel closer to him and gave the twins a new piece of their father's legacy to hold on to. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the community. Local schools began incorporating the story into their curriculum, using it to teach students about civic responsibility and the interconnectedness of community. Children would return home asking their parents about times they'd helped others or been helped themselves, uncovering countless small acts of kindness that had gone unrecognized. David Chen's police department saw a surge in applications for their youth programs. Young people inspired by the story wanted to be part of this continuing legacy of service. The department adapted, creating new opportunities for community engagement and emergency response training. David found himself spending more time mentoring than ever before, sharing not just tactical knowledge but the importance of compassion in public service. The fire department where David's father had served established a scholarship fund in his honor, specifically for young people who had been impacted by emergency responders and wanted to pursue careers in public service. Aisha and Arjun were asked to serve on the selection committee, bringing their unique perspective to choosing the recipients. Mr. Thompson's accident site became an unofficial landmark. The lamppost he'd hit was decorated with a small plaque commemorating not just Arjun's rescue of him, but the entire chain of events it had helped uncover. Local residents would often leave flowers there, adding their own notes about times they'd experienced unexpected kindness from strangers. As summer turned to fall, the Patel twins' final year of high school began with a new sense of purpose. Their classmates no longer saw them just as the babies who had been rescued from a fire, but as part of a larger story about how communities take care of their own. The twins embraced this role, using their experience to encourage others to look for ways to make a difference. Mrs. Patel found herself invited to speak at community events, sharing her perspective on resilience and gratitude. She spoke about how the fire that had nearly destroyed her family had actually revealed the true strength of their community. Her words resonated with people who had faced their own challenges, helping them see hope in their struggles. The story continued to evolve, but not in the way of viral sensations that flare bright and fade quickly. Instead, it became woven into the fabric of the community, a reminder that heroism isn't just about dramatic rescues, it's about the countless small decisions people make every day to help others, and how these decisions can echo through generations. As autumn leaves began to fall, the community prepared for another gathering, this time to celebrate the launch of a new initiative combining all their efforts. The Legacy Project, as they called it, would document and celebrate acts of community service, ensuring that these stories of connection and courage would never be forgotten. But even as they planned this celebration, none of them could guess at the next surprising turn their story would take. The Legacy Project launch was scheduled for a crisp October evening at the renovated community center. The building had been transformed into a living museum of local heroes, its walls lined with photographs and stories collected from decades of community service. At the center of it all was a digital interactive display where visitors could trace the connections between different acts of heroism throughout the years. As preparations for the launch reached their final stages, Aisha made an unexpected discovery while organizing the digital archives. She found a series of old photographs from a community cleanup project 30 years ago. In one faded image, she spotted a familiar face, her father, as a young man, working alongside David Chen's father. The photograph was dated just weeks before the fire rescue that would connect their families forever. The discovery sparked a new wave of research. Mrs. Patel spent hours going through her late husband's belongings, finding journals she'd never read before. In them, he wrote about being inspired by a firefighter who had organized the cleanup project, David's father, and how that inspiration had led him to pursue his own acts of community service, including the car rescue they'd recently learned about. Meanwhile, Arjun had been working on a special project with Mr. Thompson. They were developing a training program for young people interested in emergency response, combining traditional first aid with lessons about community building and emotional support. During one of their planning sessions, Mr. Thompson shared a story that added another layer to their intertwined history. He revealed that the day he had decided to become a police officer wasn't actually the day of his rescue. It was a week later, when he saw the firefighter who had saved him, David's father, helping a homeless family find shelter. This simple act of kindness, beyond the call of duty, had shown him that being a first responder was about more than dramatic rescues, it was about being there for the community every day. The night of the Legacy Project launch arrived with an air of anticipation. The community center was packed with people from all walks of life, first responders, community members, and families who had been touched by acts of kindness over the years. As they explored the exhibits, many found their own stories reflected in the tapestry of community service displayed on the walls. David Chen took the stage to inaugurate the project, but before he could begin his prepared speech, an elderly woman in the audience raised her hand. She introduced herself as Mrs. Lee, a retired nurse who had worked at the hospital the night Mr. Thompson was brought in as a child after his rescue. She shared a story that left the room in stunned silence. That night, she explained, another young boy had been brought in, a victim of a different accident. The boy was frightened and alone, as his parents were stuck in traffic trying to reach the hospital. Mr. Thompson, despite his own injuries, had spent hours telling the boy stories and keeping his spirits up. That boy, now grown, was serving as a paramedic in their community. He had been one of the first responders at Mr. Thompson's recent car accident, though neither of them had made the connection at the time. The revelation sparked a flurry of similar stories from the audience. It seemed that every act of kindness had sprouted branches, creating a complex web of connections that stretched across decades. The Legacy Project, intended to document past heroism, was revealing how these acts continued to influence the present in ways no one had imagined. Aisha and Arjun, watching from the side of the stage, felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they were witnessing. Their own rescue, which had seemed like the beginning of their story, was actually just one thread in a much larger tapestry. They realized that every person in the room was part of this ongoing narrative of community and care. Mrs. Patel, sitting in the front row, thought about how different her life might have been if not for that first act of heroism, David Chen rushing into a burning building to save her children. But now she understood that even that brave act had its roots in earlier moments of kindness and courage, stretching back through generations of their community. As the evening progressed, the Legacy Project's digital display was continuously updated with new connections as people shared their stories. What had started as a simple timeline of heroic acts was becoming a complex network showing how every act of kindness could spark countless others. The most touching moment came when a group of high school students presented their contribution to the project. They had created a documentary interviewing elderly community members about acts of kindness they remembered from their youth. Through these interviews, they discovered that many of today's community leaders had been inspired by acts of heroism they had witnessed or experienced as children. David's father, watching the presentation from his wheelchair, wiped tears from his eyes as he saw how his life's work had influenced so many others. He had always believed in the importance of everyday heroism, but seeing the actual impact mapped out before him was overwhelming. As the launch event drew to a close, Mr. Thompson made an announcement that would ensure the Legacy Project continued to grow. He had established a foundation to support young people who wanted to pursue careers in community service. The foundation would not only provide financial assistance but would also connect these young people with mentors who could share their experiences and wisdom. The night ended with a surprise performance by a local children's choir, singing a song they had composed about the power of helping others. As their young voices filled the room, many reflected on how the simple acts of kindness they perform today might influence future generations in ways they could never imagine. Winter arrived with a blanket of snow, but the warmth of the Legacy Project continued to spread throughout the community. What had started in their small town was beginning to catch the attention of neighboring communities, as stories of interconnected acts of kindness resonated with people far beyond their original circle. The twins' senior year was proving to be transformative. Aisha's work with the fire department had led to an unexpected opportunity. During a routine training exercise, she helped calm a young girl who had become separated from her mother during a mall evacuation drill. The girl's mother turned out to be a documentary filmmaker who had been quietly following the legacy project's development. The filmmaker, impressed by Aisha's natural ability to help others, proposed creating a series of short films about young people inspired by the project. The first episode would feature the twins, but not just as the babies who had been rescued from the fire. Instead, it would focus on how they had taken that experience and used it to inspire others. Arjun's involvement in the police youth program had evolved in unexpected ways. He discovered that his talent for technology could help bridge gaps between emergency services and the community. Working with David Chen, he developed a mobile app that would help people document and share stories of community service, creating a digital extension of the legacy project. During the app's development, they uncovered another remarkable connection. One of the software engineers helping them was the son of a firefighter who had worked alongside David's father. This engineer shared a story about how, 20 years ago, his father had saved a family's cherished photos during a house fire. That family, he revealed, was Mr. Thompson's, and those photos had included the only remaining picture of Mr. Thompson's rescue as a child. Mrs. Patel's community dinners had grown into weekly gatherings that attracted people from all walks of life. During one such dinner, an elderly gentleman recognized her late husband's name from their shared college days. He revealed that her husband had once helped organize a student volunteer program that had inspired dozens of young people to pursue careers in public service, including several current first responders in their community. The revelation led Mrs. Patel to donate her husband's old college notebooks to the Legacy Project's archives. Within their pages, they found detailed plans for community service initiatives, many of which had been implemented without anyone knowing their true origin. His vision for a connected, caring community had been quietly shaping their town for decades. David Chen's father's health took a turn for the worse during the winter months, leading to an extended hospital stay. The community rallied around him, organizing a schedule to ensure he was never alone. During these visits, more stories emerged, filling in gaps in their shared history that no one had known existed. One night, a night nurse caring for David's father shared a remarkable tale. Her grandfather had been a maintenance worker at the apartment building where Mr. Thompson was rescued as a child. He had been the one who had spotted the initial signs of danger and called emergency services, leading to the rescue that would start their chain of connected events. The nurse had grown up hearing this story, never knowing how it connected to the Legacy Project until now. The winter weather brought its own opportunities for heroism. During a particularly heavy snowstorm, Arjun's app proved invaluable in coordinating community responses to weather-related emergencies. People used it to offer help to neighbors, share resources, and document acts of kindness that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. One such act led to another surprising discovery. While helping an elderly couple clear their driveway, Aisha learned that they had been among the first donors to support the rebuild of their house after the fire. The couple had remained anonymous all these years, inspired by their own experience of community support during tough times decades ago. The Legacy Project's digital archive continued to grow, with each new story revealing more connections. They discovered that the architect who had designed the renovated community center was the daughter of a man who had been saved by David's father early in his firefighting career. She had incorporated subtle design elements throughout the building that paid tribute to first responders and community heroes. As winter deepened, the twins approached their final semester of high school. College acceptance letters began arriving, but their decisions were shaped by more than just academic opportunities. Both found themselves drawn to schools that would allow them to continue their community work while pursuing their education. Mr. Thompson's mentorship program had expanded to include regular workshops where senior citizens shared their stories of community service with young people. During one such session, a remarkable pattern emerged. Many of the elderly participants had been helped by the same people at different points in time, creating a web of reciprocal kindness that had strengthened their community for generations. The documentary filmmakers' work was revealing how the Legacy Project's influence extended far beyond their town. Other communities began reaching out, asking for guidance in starting their own projects. The twins found themselves being invited to speak at schools and community centers, sharing not just their own story but the countless others they had helped uncover. David Chen's police department had become a model for community engagement, with departments from other cities sending officers to learn from their approach. The success stories weren't just about crime prevention, they were about building trust, fostering understanding, and creating opportunities for people to help each other. Spring brought new beginnings and unexpected revelations. As the twins' graduation approached, the Legacy Project had grown beyond anyone's expectations, touching lives in ways that continued to surprise everyone involved. But the biggest discovery was yet to come, hidden in a dusty box in the hospital archives. The documentary about the Legacy Project had caught the attention of the city hospital's administration. While preparing for filming in their facility, an archivist found a collection of old incident reports from the night of Mr. Thompson's childhood rescue. Among them was a detail that no one had noticed before: the emergency room doctor who had treated him that night was Mrs. Patel's uncle. This connection sent ripples through the community. Mrs. Patel had lost touch with her uncle years ago when he moved abroad, but the discovery prompted her to reach out. Their reconnection led to even more stories emerging. Her uncle had been inspired to become a doctor after being helped by a kind stranger during his first days as an immigrant in their town. That stranger, it turned out, was David Chen's grandmother. The layers of connection seemed endless. During a spring cleaning event at the community center, volunteers found a box of old photographs from various community events. One photo showed a teenage David Chen volunteering at a cultural festival 20 years ago. In the background, clearly visible, was Mrs. Patel's husband helping to set up food stalls. They had been in the same place, helping the same community, years before the fire would bring their families together. Arjun's app had evolved into a powerful tool for connecting community members. One day, it helped coordinate responses to a minor flood in a neighboring town. During the relief efforts, they met an elderly man who had been a rookie firefighter alongside David's father. He shared a story about a warehouse fire where he and David's father had saved a family's business. That family, as it turned out, had later provided the initial funding for the scholarship program that was now helping young people pursue careers in emergency services. Aisha's work with the fire department led her to organize a community safety awareness program. During one of the sessions, a participant shared a story about being helped by a police officer during a crisis 20 years ago. The description of the officer's kindness and dedication matched Mr. Thompson's approach perfectly, and they soon confirmed it had been him. The participant had gone on to become a counselor, helping countless others during their own difficult times. The documentary filmmaker discovered something remarkable while interviewing community members. She found that many of the people who had been helped by first responders had chosen careers or volunteer work that allowed them to help others in turn. It wasn't just the dramatic rescues that inspired people, it was the everyday kindness, the small gestures that showed someone cared. David Chen's father's health improved enough for him to attend a special ceremony at the community center. During the event, he shared a story he had never told before. The day before the twins' rescue, he had visited his son at the police station and noticed him looking tired. He had shared some wisdom from his firefighting days about finding strength in the moment of crisis. David confirmed that those words had echoed in his mind as he ran into the burning building to save the twins. Mrs. Patel's catering business had become a gathering place for storytelling and community building. During a particularly busy evening, she overheard two elderly customers discussing an accident from 40 years ago. One had been saved by a young police officer, and the other had been that officer's wife. Their story of gratitude and service had inspired their children and grandchildren to pursue careers helping others, creating yet another branch in their community's tree of kindness. As graduation approached, the twins found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Other high schools had started their own legacy project chapters, documenting and celebrating acts of kindness in their communities. The simple idea that had started with a fire rescue had bloomed into a network of people committed to helping others and sharing their stories. Mr. Thompson's mentorship program had expanded to include regular meetings between retired first responders and young people interested in public service. During one such meeting, a retired paramedic shared a story about a multiple-car accident where off-duty first responders had rushed to help without being called. Among those helpers was David Chen's father, who had happened to be driving by. His quick action had saved lives and inspired several witnesses to later pursue careers in emergency services. The documentary project had grown into a series, each episode revealing new connections between people and events. The filmmaker discovered that her own father had once been helped by a young police officer during a health emergency. That officer had been inspired to join the force after being saved from a fire as a child, a fire fought by David Chen's father's unit. Spring also brought news about the app Arjun had developed. It had been noticed by emergency response coordinators in other cities, who saw its potential for building stronger communities. As they prepared to expand its reach, they discovered that many of the principles built into the app reflected the same values that had guided David's father throughout his career: the importance of connection, communication, and community support. Aisha's research for the Legacy Project uncovered a pattern in their community's history. Acts of kindness, both large and small, had created ripples that influenced generations. Children who had been helped often grew up to help others, creating a continuous cycle of community service that stretched back decades. The twins' own rescue was just one link in this ongoing chain of compassion. The day of the twins' graduation dawned bright and clear, but it wasn't just their academic achievements being celebrated. The community had gathered to mark a remarkable milestone in their shared journey. The Legacy Project had documented over 1,000 interconnected acts of kindness, creating a tapestry of compassion that spanned generations. But the most extraordinary revelation was saved for this special day. During the graduation ceremony, Mr. Thompson took the stage to deliver a surprise keynote speech. As he spoke about the power of community and service, he shared a discovery that left the audience breathless. While preparing his speech, he had found his father's old journal, which contained an entry from 50 years ago about a young immigrant couple he had helped settle in their town. That couple was David Chen's grandparents. The journal described how Mr. Thompson's father had gone out of his way to help the Chen family find housing, employment, and a sense of belonging in their new community. This act of kindness had inspired David's grandfather to become involved in community service, eventually leading to his son, David's father, becoming a firefighter. The very firefighter who would later save young Mr. Thompson's life. The revelation brought tears to David Chen's eyes. His grandparents had often spoken about the kind man who had helped them start their new life, but they had never known his name. Now, 50 years later, the circle was complete. The kindness shown to his grandparents had rippled through time, touching countless lives and eventually leading to his own rescue of the twins. Mrs. Patel shared her own surprising connection. The cultural festival where her late husband had been photographed with young David Chen had been organized by Mr. Thompson's mother. She had created the festival to help immigrant families feel more connected to the community, inspired by the story of how Mr. Thompson's father had helped the Chen family years before. The documentary filmmaker, who had been capturing these revelations, discovered something remarkable in her own family history. Her grandfather had been the real estate agent who had helped Mr. Thompson's father find the perfect location for that first cultural festival. The building, which still stood in the heart of their town, had become a symbol of community unity. Aisha and Arjun's graduation speeches reflected on how their near tragedy had transformed into a story of hope and connection. They spoke about how every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the potential to inspire others and create positive change that could last for generations. Their words resonated with everyone present, as each person could now see their own place in this interconnected web of compassion. The Legacy Project's digital archive had become a living testament to their community's spirit. The app Arjun had developed was now being used in cities across the country, helping people document and celebrate acts of kindness in their own communities. Each new story added to the archive revealed more connections, showing how deeply intertwined their lives had become through acts of service and compassion. David Chen's father, watching from his wheelchair, beamed with pride. His lifetime of service had helped create a legacy that would continue long after him. The retired firefighter had never sought recognition for his acts of bravery, but seeing how they had inspired others to serve their community filled him with joy. Mr. Thompson announced the expansion of his mentorship foundation, now named the Chen Thompson Patel Community Service Initiative. The foundation would provide resources and support to help young people pursue careers in public service, ensuring that the legacy of kindness and community support would continue for generations to come. Mrs. Patel's community dinners had become a model for other towns looking to build stronger connections among their residents. Her simple act of sharing food and stories had grown into a movement, showing how breaking bread together could break down barriers and build lasting bonds. As the graduation ceremony concluded, the twins revealed their plans for the future. Aisha had been accepted into a prestigious firefighting academy, while Arjun would be studying emergency management and technology development. They would be attending different schools but remaining connected through their shared commitment to community service. The documentary series about their story was set to air nationally, but its most important impact was local. Other communities began reaching out, sharing their own stories of interconnected acts of kindness and creating their own legacy projects. The ripple effect of that one rescue was spreading far beyond their town, inspiring people everywhere to look for ways to help others. In the final scene of the documentary, the filmmaker captured a moment that perfectly encapsulated their story. During the graduation reception, a young child got separated from her parents in the crowd. Before anyone could panic, a chain of people, young and old, from all backgrounds, worked together to reunite the family. It wasn't a dramatic rescue, but it showed how their community had learned to take care of its own. David Chen's final words in the documentary summed up what they had all learned. When I ran into that burning building to save those twins, I thought I was writing the beginning of a story. Now I realize I was actually adding another chapter to a story that began long before me and will continue long after us. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every helping hand extended to a neighbor in need, they're all part of the same story. A story of how we become better by helping each other. The Legacy Project had revealed that heroism wasn't just about dramatic rescues or grand gestures. It was about the everyday choices people made to help others, the small acts of kindness that built stronger communities, and the way these actions inspired others to do the same. Their story had shown that when one person reaches out to help another, they create a connection that can span generations and transform countless lives. As the sun set on graduation day, the community gathered for one final celebration. The walls of the community center were covered with photographs, documents, and stories spanning 50 years of interconnected acts of kindness. Looking at this visual representation of their shared history, everyone could see how their individual actions had contributed to something greater than themselves. The story that began with a desperate rescue from a burning building had evolved into a testament to the power of community, compassion, and connection. It showed that no act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Each one has the potential to inspire others and create positive change that can last for generations.